Hello, I'm Dr. Robert Weaver. I'm a Harvard-trained clinical neuropsychologist, and I have the Weaver Center, which is very passionate about helping kids and adolescents and adults and couples and families that struggle with attentional organization and some of the emotional difficulties that come along with that. And several people have written me emails, which is really nice to be getting questions, and have said, well, I know that you've kind of mentioned that you've had attention deficit and executive function, and what's your story? So here's a little rundown of my story for those of you who might be interested. I was very fortunate in the sense that I was diagnosed when I was in, I think, first grade because I had an older sibling that was diagnosed in fourth grade with having dyslexia. And in those days that they knew that learning disabilities and attention deficits and so forth were largely genetically determined. And as it turned out, my dad had some difficulties and other people in the family history. So genetics is the largest, not the only way to have learning problems. And so I was diagnosed at Boston Children's Hospital, or I think Mass General Hospital, that was at that time doing a great deal of work on dyslexia and the treatment of, and Orton Gillingham practices to help kids learn how to read and write and spell. But I certainly remember before I was diagnosed, my first school experience was at a local nursery school. And I have a feeling my mom was probably pretty excited about having me, be in school for a little bit because I was very hyperactive. I was always up in trees and on lakes, and she was always worried about the ice being too thin and where I was, and I was a bit of a management problem in those days. What I would eat, what I wouldn't eat, what I'd pay attention to, what I wouldn't pay attention to, how best to move from one place to another, small things like that. My poor mom. Anyway, so I went to this nursery school, and apparently after a couple, 2, 3 days, or maybe a week or two, my mother and father got a phone call and said, we'd like to talk with you about Bucky. That was my name back then. And apparently, or reportedly, I've heard this later, I don't remember it per se, but the teacher and the principal of the school said that your son has a little bit too much trouble with crayons, scissors, materials. Apparently, I wasn't being restricted to the places where they should be used, and I used them pretty inappropriately, and I was pretty hard to catch. And I did run away a lot of times, and apparently they thought it would be better if Bucky was at home, which I'm sure that pleased my parents a great deal. But that apparently was my first school experience. I think it lasted a couple, 2, 3 weeks, who knows. But anyway, after I was diagnosed because of my older sister, my first diagnosis was dyslexia, which I didn't know what that meant. As far as I was concerned, it was like a disease. It didn't seem like a common name to me. And later on in the history, it was minimal brain damage because they started to include hyperactivity and inattention and organization and self-esteem issues, all of which I had in great measure. And I think reading retardation was in that program. So my experiences in school were really, really hard. I was very fortunate in that my folks could provide daily Orton Gillingham, which was being researched at that time and is now used at most of the main schools for children with dyslexia or language-based learning disabilities. And I did that every day. My mother either drove me or I rode my bike, or every single day from first grade on through most of high school. Very fortunate to be able to get that kind of help. My parents did everything they could to learn about it, even though the intelligent conclusion for me was that I was dumb as a post. I mean, who doesn't know how to learn the letters or learn the alphabet or know what they sound like. And I can remember very specifically drawing the letters and saying the letters and the first word that came with those letters. And then I would go back to a letter that I just learned and had no idea what it was. So I felt pretty stupid. I think that was a pretty large cornerstone of my first feeling of self-confidence and self-esteem. And throughout school, I had real trouble with reading. In those days we read out loud, line by line. I would never know where I was. The teacher would come over, being very nice, and say, "Well, Bucky, why don't you just start right here?" And it didn't make any difference. I didn't know what the word said. And, the same with math. I could never get my math tables done. I think that was fourth grade. In those days, they had, teachers that were being trained. And so all of the kids that had some trouble with learning their math facts sat in the back of the classroom. And one by one, when they got their math facts, they'd regain the back into the classroom. And I was fortunate enough to be there all year long. I never got my math facts. Still don't have my math facts, thankfully. You know what I mean? Digital. It's a good thing. And so I was really feeling bad. I acted out. I'd much rather be in the principal's office than in the classroom. Being sick, almost anything that I could do to get out of the classroom. And, by junior high school, it was just miserable. I couldn't do what any of the other kids were doing. I was acting out a lot. I was getting F's on all my papers, doing no homework, not caring, not being invested. Why bother? The more I was invested, the more it felt bad when I did poorly. Low effort failure is a lot easier to take than high effort failure. So I learned that pretty quick. But my parents said a very important thing, and I'm going to try to riddle my conversation throughout these earlier times. My parents said a very important thing. They said in middle school, where at the time I think I was having a competition with another fellow on who could get the most attentions, which I'm a pretty competitive guy. But because I always told the truth, I didn't get expelled when the other fellow did. So that was one thing that my parents really put on me. They said, listen, just tell the truth. Get in trouble, you get in trouble. The truth isn't so bad. And, I'd much rather hear the truth, so I've always been a truth teller. But the other thing that they said, and this is what I was getting onto, they said, we no longer are going to emphasize grades. In those days, they had attitude marks, 1 through 4, 4 being terrible. So I had F's and all 4s. But they said anybody can have a good attitude, and anybody can pay attention to the teacher, and anybody can offer to clear the board or wash the board or put things away or advocate for yourself. Just ask for what you need. If you need some time out, enjoying the teachers with an understanding of the frustrations and anger that you have. And that was really important for me because I learned that better relationships are as good as doing well in school if that's the best you can do. And also my parents knew that if I was doing the best I could in terms of attitude and trying and so on and so forth, I clearly was doing the best I could do, even though it might be terrible. So teachers began to give me, more support, more appreciation, instead of being a bad guy that required the toughest old birds of teachers, which I did have a few. So that was a pretty big turning point. I also had some trouble with acting out in the community and, with my parents. And, I was an angry, depressed young lad that couldn't do what everybody else seemed to be doing so easily. So then I also didn't have any friends during that time. I had, by the end of middle school, maybe one friend who also wasn't doing very well. Very quiet guy, but, it was nice to have a friend. And then through high school, I started to do sports. I started to have a much better social life, and I really enjoyed the other parts other than academics. However, I was also in all the level 3 classes, which we referred to ourselves as the Ritz, because there's the Ritz-Carlton in Boston, very fancy place. And we referred to one another as the Ritz. retards in training. I mean, we could call ourselves that, but not anybody else. But we were always in rooms with no windows, or someplace with a couple, two, three teachers that were learning, and it was a tough time. There were some good teachers that really worked to understand and to support me, and I really appreciate that, and I gravitated towards them. And one of the best things that I did was architecture, and I really gravitated towards the architecture teacher, because if I was going to skip class, it might as well be where somebody could find me. So there you have it. But all the while, my parents really did everything they could to understand my learning abilities and disabilities. They seemed to always be supportive and positive. I really reinforce that with families that I see now. Somehow believing that once the academic part of my life was over, that I would be fine. I always had somatic complaints, and my stomach hurt, and it was very difficult. You could read my autobiography on the Weaver Center website. And so I had a tough time getting into college. And even when my parents said, "So what do you want to do about college?" I said, "All this time you've been telling me I'm a smart person. Who would sign up for another 4 years of this? 2 years?" So anyway, they really helped me, and my father and my mother, as they often did, they read to me, and they helped me study for things, and so on and so forth, and helped me fill out the applications by asking me questions, and so on and so forth. And I finally went to a small school, great school, but it wasn't in this country. And in those days, it was really expensive to be calling home. So after the first semester, I did have a couple of phone calls, because I was just failing everything. In college, of course, they expect you to be reading and writing and taking tests and so on and so forth. You weren't like in classes where if you didn't throw something, you were, in pretty good shape. So my father talked with me, because I was going to be home for the holiday times and didn't want to go back to school. So he talked with me about advocating for myself, letting the professors there know that I had a learning problem, and so on and so forth, that I would like to, get through somehow, and could they help me? And gave me some information that was written for them to see. And so when I returned, I said I would give it another shot. When I returned, I was put in English as a second language student. I was the only one there that was still reading SRA and the different color readings and comprehension books. Anyway, so I know that my time's getting rather long here, so I will try to make the rest of this relatively short. So by advocating for myself and going into tests and saying, "Listen, let me scratch some notes. I do know the material." I did a lot of auditory discussions with people and girlfriends and friends that would help me learn the material, so I knew the material, but I just couldn't write it down. So after still trying very hard, I finally got through with a lot of help from my friends. And I learned, one of my friends said, "Hey, of course you felt stupid. That was the intelligent conclusion. If you weren't smart, you probably wouldn't be figuring out how much effort you were putting in versus other people." And so I continued on to college and graduate school, and the more I was interested, the more I did better and better and better. And the story is something that I pass along to a lot of kids who are struggling in this domain, that there is a lot of hope, not just a little bit of hope, because there's a lot of strengths that come with having differences, including persistence, resilience, esteem, self-knowledge. And what we do now is develop the self-advocacy manual, which is terrific for these kinds of things. And again, we do a lot of work, over Skype and so forth. But again, if anybody has any questions or thoughts about this, please don't hesitate to write me an email, rweaver@weavercenter.org, or visit our website at www.weavercenter.org and check us out. Ask some questions. I'd be very happy to do my very best to answer them. All right. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it big time.